Hey everyone, it's Paul Bertorelli reporting for AVweb. And like most aviation journalists, we tend to obsess on things with numbers and also numbers related to pilot population. And with me here in the Zoom room is Jason Blair, who is a veteran instructor and a designated pilot examiner. Jason, you pour over these numbers even to a larger extent than I do. Uh, so what are you seeing in some of the recent things that the FAA has released in terms of pilot population data?
Sure, and this is probably there's maybe four or five of us in the aviation industry that really get kind of geeked out every year when we see those U.S. civil aviation statistics get posted, and we kind of bounce some text messages and some messages back and forth, and think this is pretty cool stuff, and dig a lot deeper. And I think it's kind of important for us to look at some of these trends because it does help us understand what's happening in our industry and how healthy it is, and we have been seeing a generally declining number of pilots through the years here. And I think, as you know, the 70s and kind of early 80s were those peak points where we had a good baby boomer generation of pilots, and they were pretty robust, and we made a lot of airplanes. And then it's been a kind of a slow decline since then, but it has been kind of stabilizing too. And we've seen a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years, especially as let's talk about the perception of a great career, right? We keep talking about pilot shortages, and I think over the last couple of years, even through some of the effects of COVID, we've seen increased numbers of people, getting student pilot certificates, completing ratings, especially U.S. pilots who are doing that. And the flight training industry has been booming lately. The last 2 years have been busy as you can get, and the airlines are now starting to rehire people back. We had a very active hiring period in 2018 and 2019 before we saw the downturn, and that kind of slowed it. But they're returning quickly, and that means there's a demand for it. And if we really think about it, the parents who are talking to their sons and daughters in high school are getting a good message right now that, boy, this is a darn good career. And I think that's starting to resonate with a lot of people who are coming into aviation, and they're going for it. So we're starting to see some of those numbers come back up in terms of new starts, and I think that is also helping to stabilize some of the loss that we had over the years. But we also have an aging pilot
Yeah, let
population.
me I'll stop you right there, and I'll throw up the chart here showing the overall pilot population. Now this graph shows all pilots, all ratings, and it has been in graceful decline for well since the 90s. And now, if you look at the end there, it's starting to level out a little bit and actually increase a little bit. And so, where are these increases coming from by your perception? Is this people who want to go become professional pilots, or is it people who want to fly personal airplanes, or both, or what is the ratio?
So I think a lot of it is professional-based, career-focused training, and we're seeing at a lot of the university programs and a lot of the large academy-style training programs wait lists. And one of the universities that I work with regularly when I give practical tests, it's kind of become common that they're not going to fly in their first year anymore. They're going to have to get some coursework done, and they're going to have to get into the flying part in their second year. Some of the students are a little bit savvy on that, and they're doing their private externally, so they can transfer that into a 141 program. But the university programs, everyone that I talk to is full with waiting lists, and the students are running through it. So when we think about the people that are doing that, it really is a lot of career-based training. I see a little bit less of the what we'll call pleasure and business pilot training than maybe we saw in the 90s, where a lot of us kind of saw maybe that was maybe a 70-30 for professional versus local. A lot of it's very career-based at this point. So that, I think, that's our biggest growth segment right now, and that's where a lot of the flight training providers are focusing their efforts. They're focusing it on the people who are trying to get through ratings and certificates relatively quickly, and then become a CFI or find something else to gain some flight experience to get into service in that airline job that they're looking for,
So,
or Part 135 or cargo, whatever it happens to be.
so what does that mean for, say, a near-term future of 5 years or maybe 7 years? Eventually, that pipeline is going to either fill up or dry up, however you want to define it, and that demand will decrease. Then do we get back in a situation where we're seeing declining overall numbers again?
That's a great question, and some of this is anecdotal on my part. It's interesting how when we talk to a lot of the younger pilots, especially those that I'm giving tests to, and a lot of times we'll break the ice on a check ride and say, "Man, what got you into this?" And it's interesting how many times the answer is just, "Well, my parents thought it was a good job. I thought it was a good job." And if you follow that question up with, "Hey, you ever think about buying an airplane and flying on your own on the side?" The answer in most cases now is, "Well, not really. Why would I do that? I'd rather go home and play some video games," which breaks my heart a little bit as a super passionate pilot, right? I mean, there's a lot of days where I go out and do a check ride or do some professional flying, and if I get home and my wife says, "What do you want to do tonight?" I say, "Well, let's get in our old Stinson and go fly somewhere for dinner." I still want to go do a little bit of flying, and I don't know if that's all always going to be there with the younger generation, but it certainly is with a few of them, and some of them are there, and I'm really hoping that they develop a passion for that. We definitely have an aging pilot population. Some of the data that I put out recently showed our ATP pilot certificate data. We're nearing 20% of our ATP certificate holders are over the age of 65, which means they're not flying for an airline anymore, and they might be flying, some other stuff, charter, a little bit of flight instruction. But certainly, at some point, we all earn the right to retire, and at some point, we all retire permanently, and those numbers I think are going to drop off. So I do think we're going to see a continued decline in overall pilot population. We'll probably see a drop in some of those ATP numbers. And the same holds true of our CFI numbers. Right now, we're looking at a little over 120,000 CFIs who have certificates, which are active, which right now means they've renewed that within the last 2 years. So it's a live certificate. They're there. But as they age as well, we're going to see those drop off. And I think that's going to show a big change in our numbers over the next decade. And we've got to figure out how to keep this industry alive, and not just for the professional side, but to keep our local airports thriving, and keep folks having some fun out there flying too.
Those applicants who say, gee, I'm just in this for the job, um, they're probably not going to be buying airplanes. They're probably not going to be flying airplanes for personal use on the side. So that represents, I assume, an erosion in interest in personal GA flying.
It
But
certainly
but
does.
we don't see it yet in demand for new airplanes, and especially used airplanes.
Also true, and I think we're seeing a pretty heavily increasing price in the used airplane market, especially in a few of the makes and models that are most common. The 182 is probably one of the hardest ones to find a good one right now, right? And Cherokee 6s and 172s and Archers, and the price point on these, if we think somebody who's early in their career, maybe they're a first officer at a regional airline. We've driven prices up on these where even used airplanes may be outside of the market that they're looking for right now, especially as they're starting families, early career, maybe having to commute for the job. Maybe when they get to that senior airline captain, that might be something they're going to look at. And something I haven't released yet is we're going to have to talk about mechanics too. And we kind of have this three-legged stool of flying where we need CFIs to train us, and we need some people to maintain these airplanes, and we need the airplanes. And if we look back into 1999, we had about 350,000 mechanic certs held, and we're at about 315,000 this year. There's been a couple dips in there, but anecdotally, I can tell you I know of 3 flight training providers. They're smaller local FBO schools right now that all 3 of them have multiple airplanes down waiting for maintenance, because the maintenance techs are getting older and retiring too, and they just don't have somebody to keep the airplanes flying. So
Yeah,
we're going to have to talk about that too.
that trend line on the technicians has not really leveled out. It's continued to go down.
Very much so.
And so how are these schools addressing that, or how's the industry going to address this?
This is a topic I think that's just starting to come up, and maybe it's the canary in the coal mine kind of moment where we're all going to have to start thinking about, boy, how are we going to get younger people into the maintenance side of this? I know of a couple operators that have had basically employment ads out for months and months, and have 0 applicants for the maintenance side, which is a little bit scary. And if we look back, kind of this was more of a mentor relationship where somebody had an A&P, and they might have had a couple of 18 to 22-year-olds in the hangar working with them and learning some of this stuff. And it's great to go through school, but when you're trying to learn a bunch of different airplanes, that experience is really valuable too. It's a little bit more of a trade school mentor relationship to get that experience too. And I think we've got to get some vitality back in that portion of it, and recognize the value of those maintenance providers. This is not just, slapping a new piece on the plane and hoping it goes. These things got to be put together, and we got to have people who can maintain them. Otherwise, we're not going to be flying much anymore.
Is it your impression that the state of maintenance in the fleet in general is not what it should be because of this?
I haven't seen any major degradations in the state of maintenance. I think that the folks that do it understand the risk and the liability, and in most cases, they really just flat care, right? They don't want somebody that they worked on their airplane to go out and get hurt either. I think the state is that the delay is happening, and we find this if people need avionics installed, if they want an engine, and we've obviously got currently some supply chain issues going on it, but the bigger issue is just having the people, power, and time, and to get the maintenance done. And when an airplane's sitting, that means nobody's flying it for fun, passion, or for career training. So we've got to figure out how to get these turned and value that maintenance sector as well.
Here's a chart that shows the instrument rating activity. It's increasing. Is this a result of the professional pilot training? Because if you're a professional pilot, you're going to have an instrument rating, or are you seeing some personal GA ownership activity there?
Yeah, the instrument rating is really, kind of a critical piece when we look at the training sector, and whether somebody wants to fly personally for pleasure and business and have that extra ability to fly with some weather conditions that are a little less than the VFR. Doesn't mean they have to be flying through super hard IFR, but just to open those days to climb through, descend through clouds, things like that, it opens a lot. But when we think about the career-based training, it is absolutely necessary, and pretty much everybody that's going through training to get to a commercial operation somewhere, whether it's here in the US or internationally, they're going to have that instrument rating. So they start with that main course, its primary instrument, and then a commercial, and some of them choose to do a commercial multi-engine first, some do the commercial single and then add on the multi. And in many cases, if they're foreign students, they don't do a commercial single engine. They do their private instrument, commercial multi, and then transition back to their home countries where they may go into service. And that's been a big section of training for a lot of years here. 30 to 40% of the US market has traditionally been for foreign students. And we've seen a little drop off of that in the last year here with COVID restrictions, but that's been a big part of the business model. And the instrument rating is just one of those steps in that career pilot path that you're going to have to check that box.
So we're entering the third year now of the pandemic. What, from your impression, has been the impact of the pandemic on training and the pilot pipeline?
So good question. I think it was really interesting in the beginning of it. We had questions, as everybody did, about what could you do, what couldn't you do, and a lot of the flight training providers out there, with the help of the associations, I know FASANA helped a lot, and AOPA helped a lot, came up with solutions, and they figured out how to train with masks on and how to clean the airplanes properly. And when we look at it, we saw very little degradation of total pilot certification numbers through the last 2 years, and it's actually kind of amazing, because we did see degradation in some of the international training requests, and actually later this week there'll be some data coming out from FASANA that shows that we saw the security threat assessments that were reduced in terms of how many people from international market, non-US citizens were getting training here, and that had an effect on those training providers that were focused heavily on international students. And what a lot of them did is when that market got a little bit down, they focused heavily on US students. And I think, as we looked at a major degradation, a big drop off in senior captains at airlines that took early retirements, maybe they were 62, 63 years old. When we slowed down, they took the retirements, and, they're not coming back, which means we've got to fill that pipeline back up from the bottom. So you're seeing very active hiring at the major airlines. They're taking people, from the regional airlines. That means the regional airlines are really hiring actively from the CFIs that were working over the last couple of years, that gained experience, built enough time to meet either restricted or regular ATP minimums. And, the unintended consequence of that is it also means a lot of the flight schools are losing their CFIs over the last few months. And a lot of the large flight schools have seen 70 to 80% turnover of their CFI population within the last 6 months.
Is it your sense that any of the foreign countries have taken up creating their own training infrastructure?
There's a little bit of it here and there, but let's be honest, the U.S. FAA certificate is still kind of the gold standard, for a lot of places in the world, and we've got JAA and EASA stuff out there, but there are still a lot of places in the world that focus on the U.S. as the base training certificate, right? So they get a private, an instrument, a commercial multi here, and then they transition back home and finish up their ATPL equivalent, whatever that equivalent is in their country, to go into service as a first officer in whatever airplane they're going to be operating in. A lot of that is sponsored training. I guess one thing we've seen so far is that international market has not come up quite as much as the U.S. training market has in the last, maybe year here, as some of that international training is not needed with the lower international flight, numbers of flights that are happening between right now. I certainly think that's going to come back. And when it comes back, we're probably the best place to service that in terms of having the training infrastructure here in the US. And I know a lot of flight training providers are looking forward to that and more than happy to do it too.
When do you think the intensity of this airline hiring begins to taper off?
That's a good question. It's a crystal ball question, right? And I talk to a lot of students that are career based, and a lot of them, if I sit down and talk to them and say, well, what's your career goal? And they say, I want to be an airline pilot. And I say, do you want to be a senior airline pilot when you're 65, right? And they say, yes. I said, then your job is to get in there as soon as possible. And it's sometimes about that seniority number, right? To get in, get through your regional, get to your major, get that job stability. We've all seen through, the years, some furloughing. I think we're going to see this hiring last for a little while, though. We are producing ATPs at a slower rate right now than we need to hire every month. And so when I say that, last month, January 2022 here, just a few days ago, we produced a whole 956 ATPs in the entire month here in the US. That's actually a record number for us since back to like 2016. Through 2021, we were averaging 300 to 400 ATPs per month. And, if we look at some of the airlines, for example, I think American said they wanted to hire 700 pilots a month, right? Or something close to that number. Well, that's just one airline. So if we're not even producing enough ATPs to meet the needs of one airline per month, that means those major airlines are going to be hiring from the lower level airlines, and we've got to find a way to backfill it. So I think, we've got a training capacity question here that we've got to solve. There's only so many airplanes that are out there to do this in. If we have limited numbers of CFIs, and there's only a certain amount of time in airports to do it in. So I think our hiring is going to last for a while. And if I'm talking to little Susie or little Billy's parents, and they're 18 years old right now thinking about, is this a good career? My answer is, boy, you got a few years of real good hiring looking coming up here. And we're going to have to backfill this and really build that next generation to get them through. Our training infrastructure is working hard for it. But I think we had enough people retire out, and we have enough people in aging population that's going to last for a while.
Why is it that the ATP activity hasn't picked up? Is it just they can't accumulate the hours fast enough? Is that an effect of the 1,500-hour rule?
So there's a couple effects there, and I'll kind of dive into something about that 1,500-hour rule too. When that rule came into place, I was a part of some of the rulemaking committees on it, and we watched what was happening. And it's great to say 1,500 hours. We have the restricted ATP, and it seems like about a third of the ATP certificates that are being issued right now each year are restricted ATPs, which means they've probably come through a 2-year, 4-year college, right? The rest are straight up ATPs. But one of the major constrictions we have in that ATP is there's that CTP course, right? The ATP Commercial Training Program course, and those are kind of costly. So that course is now, and has been for a while, a prerequisite to take the ATP knowledge test. Most of the people that are doing their ATPs right now are doing so as they go through an airline training program. So, if they go to one of the regional airlines, that's a part of their in-dock training. They finish that ATP, CTP, and there's just limited numbers of those courses. So our throughput, unless we add a bunch of courses, and one of the constrictions in that course is level 5D simulator time is a part of that. And there's, there's simulators out there, but they're being used in airline training, and there's only so much simulator time. And most of the simulators around the country and to be honest, kind of around the world. We're running like 23 hours a day going into the COVID time, and there's only so much you can push through. So we do have some restrictions there, and that limits our number of ATPs that we can push through. There's been some discussion and pushback towards reducing minimums again, and I think there was an airline last week that made some statements to that and said, well, we should just cut that 1,500-hour rule down. And one of the unintended consequences that I would foresee of that is if we just cut those hours down and say, look, you can be a 300-hour pilot with your commercial, that would be a bunch of people that wouldn't become CFIs and wouldn't stay as a CFI. And that would actually kind of undercut our ability to
Right.
have the CFIs to train the next generation too. So while it sounds great on the surface, some of the unintended consequences might actually make the problem worse.
Yeah, it's a kind of a delicate balance there in a system that really doesn't have a lot of margin in it. There's not a lot of CFIs, and you need more ATPs, and then you have the training infrastructure problem. Also, looking at some of the other data, women pilots, where's that trend going from where you sit?
Sure, and it's interesting to kind of look at that data. I've been watching that one for a couple of years now, and the good news is we are seeing larger percentages of female aviators coming into the system. If we go back to like 2011, it was about 12% of student pilot certificates were females, and we're up this past year to about 14, and we went from about 6.5% of total certificates held to about 9%. It's certainly not where we want it to be, and one could argue that maybe one of the fastest ways to solve the pilot shortages that we have is get that representative ratio a little bit closer to what it is in the general population and interest more female aviators. So we're at least not headed in the wrong direction, but I think we could move that a lot faster too, and get some more younger aviators who are female into this career path.
How would you do that if that were up to you?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the coolest thing to do is get people flying, right? And we just need to drag people into airplanes and show them how cool this is, and make sure that we do that in anywhere there are women as well, and incorporate that into some of the activities that everybody's in. So, we've got to get people understanding that while this has traditionally been a very male-dominated field, times change, and we can change that. And I'll be honest, some of the absolute best aviators I've met, and some of the smartest ones in aviation I've ever had the opportunity to work with, are the female ones. And a lot of times they're smarter than us guys, right?
It happens. Okay, we'll close it out there. We've been speaking with Jason Blair, who's a flight instructor and an experienced designated pilot examiner. And the second part of this video, we'll take a look at what he's seen in pilot examinations. Thanks again, Jason.
My pleasure.